Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes.
Greetings and blessings, and welcome back to Curious Naked Diatribes. This episode is part 3 in the U.S. Selection Series. In part 1, I talked about the electoral college system that emerged out of slavery and is still with us today. A racist and anti-democratic system, I might add, that I think it's about time we get rid of. And in part 2, I talked about the two-party stranglehold the Democrats and Republicans have on us. And why don't we have more political parties and a better election system like ranked choice voting? Why is it that we can't seem to accomplish these things? If you're new to this series, you may have guessed that I see huge problems with so-called U.S. democracy, a word that never once appears in the U.S. Constitution, by the way. A system that so many are willing to kill and die to defend. And I'll ask you yet another question. Just whose interests are being represented in our representative democracy? To answer that would take a lot more than a 3-part podcast series. I mean, there's just simply too much I want to say. But I'll do my best to keep it on point. One of the things I think everyone must admit sooner or later is that U.S. power reaches far beyond the 48 contiguous states, Alaska and Hawaii. Many already acknowledge this. Some openly boast about it, claiming that the U.S. is the rightful leader of the globe. Maybe going so far as to say it's divinely ordained that this is so. Then there are those who are a bit more squeamish when you start to throw around words like U.S. empire and U.S. imperial power. They much prefer the innocuous term republic. But the fact remains that the United States has more than 750 military bases in over 80 countries around the world. The U.S. also spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And if that's new information for you, forgive me for reminding you that in addition to that, the president is also the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, which is obscenely large. In fact, the largest the planet has ever seen. So remember this when you head to the polls or mail in your ballot. Remember that what you're really voting for is an emperor-commander, which is strange when you consider how few people would say they are voting based on foreign policy. I love this term, foreign policy. Such a harmless term, and yet it's the elephant in the room. Oh, foreign policy, never mind that, just leave it to the experts. Experts like Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and so on. Don't know these companies? Google. Now, before moving on, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the political moment we're in and what it means for women and women of color in particular. Kamala Harris, of course, is the first woman to be elected vice president of the U.S., and now possibly will be the first woman to be elected president. Okay, I realize the importance of breaking this barrier and the example this would set for girls and young women who may see new possibilities where they didn't exist before. I also want to make it abundantly clear that I am in no way a Trump supporter, past, present, or future. He's a foul creature unfit to be dog catcher, much less president. So, would I like to see a woman president? And more women in politics in general? Absolutely. However, Harris does have some experience in Washington, and race and gender alone, in my book, is not reason enough. Just think of Clinton. I mean, we don't need another Margaret Thatcher. So yes, Harris has inherited a political dumpster fire, to put it lightly. And when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine, she's inherited Biden's genocide. She's made it quite clear that she's not deviating. She's not going to budge. And for many voters, that's a deal breaker. But instead of me, a white male, mansplaining this, I'm going to hand the mic over to an actual woman of color, Ijeoma Oluo, author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race? Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, and her latest, Be a Revolution, How Everyday People Are Fighting Oppression and Changing the World, and How You Can Too. And spoiler alert, I didn't interview her myself. This is an interview from the YouTube channel On Strike. The audio isn't the best, but bear with me.
And a country like the United States, literally built off of the blood of one exploited people, multiple exploited people, and the extermination of another, exploited people, it is so important to recognize that is only maintained through more blood. And the way in which you justify that is through story, right? Story of the relative worth of other peoples. And so these incredibly harmful, murderous stories about what Native lives are worth, about what Black lives are worth, about what Palestinian lives are worth, about what disabled lives are worth, about what workers are worth, justify this machine that harms us all. And so it's important that we tackle that. It's important that we recognize our shared humanity, that we recognize our shared struggle, and that we do a better job, honestly, of educating each other of how this works. The one thing that's been made really clear to me this last year as a Black woman is how much of a better job we have to do, those of us who do movement work, those of us who are educated about global colonialism and imperialism, of how dangerous this mix is for us, of how much these are the same oppressors, how much these systems will come back on us, how no one is safe if this is allowed to continue. And, outside leaving our general humanity alone, right, no one should be able to look at what's been happening and be okay with it. But if you are concerned with your safety and an argument is being made that your safety requires the oppression of other people, it is important to ask who benefits really from that argument, who's making that argument over and over again. And it's the same people who turn around and justify violence against us.
In this 2024 election, more and more people are beginning to realize the real power of the Israel lobby to influence the outcome of U.S. elections. In fact, according to data from the Federal Election Commission, AIPAC, or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, spent over $100 million in 2024 alone to help defeat candidates they considered too sympathetic to the Palestinians. Think about that for a moment. That's just one Israel lobby group. There are plenty others. And yet for years, we've all had to listen to the media hammering into us that Russia was in fact responsible for the outcome of the 2016 election. I think it's absolutely disgusting. The level of hypocrisy is astounding, but hypocrisy is the least of it. The world has been witnessing Israel commit genocide for over an entire year now, fully supported by the United States and paid for with your tax money. But that's not really what either of the two major party candidates are talking about in the debates. All anyone can really manage to say is Hamas terrorists, blah, blah, blah. October 7th, blah, blah, blah. Israel has a right to defend, blah, blah, blah. Anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. They'll just beat you over the head with it again and again and again, hoping you'll become so brain dead you won't remember yesterday, much less 25, 50, 100 years of history. The only thing they're debating is which candidate will do more to support Israel and their campaign of terror and mass murder, which they conveniently reduce to a humanitarian crisis. Now that's a much easier pill for the American public to swallow than genocide. And Kamala Harris can't even bring herself to utter the number of civilian casualties in Gaza, leaning instead on far too many. Far too many? No. There are far too many people at this restaurant. There are far too many people in line for concert tickets. As of this recording, there are over 42,000 Palestinian men, women, and children massacred with bombs made by who? Lockheed Martin. Paid for by who? U.S. taxpayers. So as you head to the polls this November, ask yourself, are we able to vote in favor of the environment? Are we able to vote against war? Are we able to vote for an alternative to capitalism? I think if you take a serious look, you'll find that in our current system, we really can't. I mean, consider the fact that to a capitalist, a dead tree has more value than a living one, or that the sale of a fighter jet is considered good for the US economy, while it completely obliterates another. How do we move past something like this? How do we get past necropolitics? Well, if you want me to be perfectly honest, I don't think we can reform our way out of this. I don't think we can vote our way out of this hell. I'm not suggesting you don't vote. Go vote. But vote with the understanding that elections are really just a sideshow, a distraction, and that the real change comes from getting together and organizing. But that's just it. I think most people are truly afraid of real change, despite the general agreement that the current system is supremely shitty. Whether you want to call it capitalism, whether you want to call it hyper-capitalism, whether you want to call it post-capitalism, or what Marxist economist Yanis Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, the story remains the same. And I remain firmly convinced that no matter what you call this system we're in, there are far more people harmed by it than those that benefit. So where does this leave us? We can't expect perfection from any system, but we can, and we need to, demand something better. I hope you've enjoyed this series from Curious Naked Diatribes. Thanks for listening. Que todo sea amor, walk tall, live free.
Javi Media.